Hey, everybody. Thank you for listening to Politics. A lot of you keep asking, how can I keep up with you? I want to know what's going on at the Capitol all the time. You can always follow me on social media at TMFTX on both Facebook and Twitter at TMFTX. Thank you for listening to Politics. Hello, welcome to Politics, your one-stop shop for all things politics, all things Texas. I'm your host, State Representative Trey Martinez Fischer. I hope you're having a good week. We're going to have a wonderful show today. Very informative show. All over the country, we're already seeing news and signs of these massive voter reforms taking place at different legislatures across the country. This is all happening in response and reaction to President Biden getting elected to the White House. Suddenly, folks want to make voting harder. Imagine that. Texas is not immune to that. We are dealing with two proposals in Senate Bill 7, House Bill 6, priorities of Republican Governor Greg Abbott and the Republican majority to change the rules about voting. And of course, this is coming on the heels of what we saw happen in Georgia with their supposed election reforms and all the controversy, everything from members of the Georgia legislature being arrested for fighting for their constituents, from Major League Baseball taking the All-Star game out of Georgia, and a number of corporations saying we're going to put a stop to all of this voter suppression, and we're going to call it what it is. I'm going to have a wonderful conversation today with two guests. We're going to have the Voter Protection Director from the state of Georgia, Saira Draper, and we're going to have the Voter Protection Director for the state of Texas, Clouston. They both work for the Democratic Party in their states. They're going to tell you what's going on with these voter suppression tactics and what we can do to fight back. So we're going to have a great show. Thank you for listening. Welcome to Politics. Thank you for listening. If you have a suggestion for the show or an idea for a potential episode, I value your feedback. Email your suggestions to contact@TreyMartinezFisher.com. As always, thank you for listening to Politics. Hey, everybody, welcome back. I told you on our pod that we would be talking about elections and election reforms. And I tell you what, I spent a lot of time reading these bills, talking to my colleagues, and frankly, we're kind of scratching our head as to, what is this solution? What problem is this solution looking for? I have two guests today that this is what they do for a living. This is their job to engage on behalf of their states. I have the voter protection directors for the state of Georgia, and that's Saira Draper, and for the state of Texas, and that's Clouston. Their job is to protect voter integrity for our party, and I think we have a lot to discuss. Georgia has just gone through a massive voter reform that is now, sort of the top of the national news, and every single day we're waking up to a new voice joining the debate and talking about the senseless reforms that are doing really nothing other than taking away people's right to vote. And I think that that's something that we're beginning to see now. And of course, this is, we're not too far behind Georgia and the state of Texas. We are currently looking at a number of proposals that would do virtually the same thing. So let me turn it to my guests, and Saira, if it's okay, I want to start with you and just sort of give us a little thumbnail of what was happening in Georgia and what ended up passing and becoming law very, very recently.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and tell you a little bit about our experience here in Georgia, because we've seen a lot of similarities just with what's happening in Texas. And I think it's really important to share these experiences and learn from each other. So we just had our session just ended here in Georgia, and SB 202 did pass. It was signed into law within hours of it passing in a somewhat secretive ceremony, but closed door ceremony by our governor. Despite being called the Election Integrity Act, it is really anything but. Just goes to show that your eyes can't roll back into your head far enough that they call this thing the Election Integrity Act. It basically makes voting harder. And I think it's really important to understand the context under which this bill was passed. We had two elections, the November election and the runoff election in January, that were under a microscope. And that were audited, and we had recounts, and all levels from the federal to the state said that Georgia had a good, clean, fair election. And so this really is, seeking a problem for a solution for where there isn't a problem. But SB 202, just to give you some of the highlights, because it is a very long bill and it's a very complex bill, and there was no transparency behind this bill. The different subs came in and came out, and the others, the Democrats weren't provided any opportunity to look at these subs, were not provided any opportunity to, engage with the process of changing the bill. So it was really shoved through committee and passed into law. But let me give you just the highlights. So, on the early voting side, it basically limits the amount of time that you have to apply for your absentee ballot. It takes away the signature process that we had before and forces voters to have either a ID, a driver's license, or a state ID that they have to get in order to be able to vote by mail. And it makes it so that counties have much less time to send out and process these ballots, so that there's going to be a very significant time crunch, especially on our big counties. Of course, our big counties tend to run Democratic, so this is a theme you'll see throughout the bill, although it may have the same direction to all our 159 counties in here in Georgia. The impact, the challenges that it presents are going to be much more felt by our bigger counties, our Democratic counties, and that's certainly by design. One thing that they've done is they've made drop boxes, which we had for the first time during the pandemic, in which voters and election supervisors and elections offices alike very much appreciated. They're taking these drop boxes and they're making them essentially obsolete. So before, voters could have had 24-hour access to these drop boxes because they were placed outside. And now they're saying, that there's security issues around that, even though there was no evidence of any kind of security issue, even though these things were bolted to the ground, and there was 24-hour surveillance on them. And they're saying that you can only have a drop box if it's inside an early voting location. So that makes it much less accessible for the people in the public. It makes them functionally obsolete because you could already turn in your absentee ballot to many early voting locations. So I said I was going to do a quick overview. I'll just give you one more example. I see you asking a question.
I am, but you're on a roll, so you go ahead and finish.
I'll just give you one more quick example. So in early voting, one thing that they're doing, which is really transparent, I think, is in runoff elections, like the ones we just had that sent Senator Ossoff and Warnock to the U.S. Senate, they are taking the early voting time, which used to be a required 3 weeks, and condensing it to 5 days. So yeah, Georgia had very big problems with long lines. I don't know if you saw some of our national headlines in June after our primary showed 11-hour lines on election day. And the reason we didn't suffer that same fate in November and in January was because we opened up early voting options. So by closing off these early voting options, we are going to return to a place where we have very, very long lines on election day, which of course, causes voting numbers and participation to suffer.
Well, that's very interesting. A couple of things, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought, former President Trump spent a lot of time putting pressure on Georgia election officials to throw this election out or go find ballots where they didn't exist. And everything I saw on national news, sounded to me like the Secretary of State pretty much said that there wasn't a problem with elections in Georgia. Am I right? Did I miss something?
You didn't miss anything. And, again, we had 2 recounts and an audit of the November election. So, and in addition to that, we had a signature match audit conducted by the GBI and the Secretary of State here. We had Trump appointed federal judges saying that there wasn't an issue with the elections in Georgia. So yeah, again, looking for a problem where there is one.
Okay, well, listen, I think it's timely that we're talking with you in Georgia because of you just having this experience, and Texas is now going through it, but also from politically and metrically speaking, a lot of states often say that as you see trend lines moving in Georgia, Texas is not far behind. And so, we were talking earlier before the show about Stacey Abrams, someone I met years ago, and she often would tell me that what changes happening in Georgia, you'll see in Texas pretty soon. So, and here we are, Rose, we are now, defending our own voter suppression bills. And so, this is fresh on the minds of Texans across the state. Very recently, and Saira, this may be news to you, we had a Republican, give public comments in a news interview, Representative Kyle Cassell, who sort of said, I don't even know if we need these changes, kind of sounding like your Secretary of State, just kind of being matter of fact, right? But Rose, why don't you walk us through, we have Senate Bill 7 and we have House Bill 6. I think, one's ugly and one's uglier, if you ask me, but for the purposes of our listeners and those who watch online, give us a sense of what these bills are purported to do.
Sure. Just like there's some similarities with Georgia in that these bills are certainly targeted at Black and Brown communities and our urban areas. And they also here target mail ballots, which are used on a very limited basis in Texas. So a lot of the specifics are different because, quite frankly, Georgia had more opportunities to vote in 2020 than we did here in Texas. But the aims are certainly the same, where we know that our Republican representatives see those trend lines as well and see that more Texans are voting and more Texans are voting for Democrats and doing everything they can to cling to power. So specifically, Senate Bill 7 would limit early voting hours. So you saw Harris County open up overnight voting so that shift workers and folks, doctors and nurses could vote after their shifts, and they want to take those opportunities away. Senate Bill 7 would also ban drop boxes. Funny thing, drop boxes are not legal in Texas to begin with and have never existed here. So you want to talk about a solution in search of a problem? No one ever talked about using them because they're not legal. You got to show an ID to return your mail ballot in person. But some of the really insidious provisions are that they would give poll watchers free reign over the polling place. And I managed our poll watcher program in 2020. I'm super proud of our Democratic poll watchers who were there to support voters and make sure things went smoothly. But giving them unfettered access to the polling place and not allowing the election workers to regulate them in meaningful ways is just a recipe for disaster. And we heard testimony from the president of the NAACP a couple of weeks ago that just really elucidated that, Texas has a really problematic history with poll watchers, and that this sort of free reign would certainly lead to voter intimidation of voters of color and be used against them disproportionately. There's another provision of that bill that would let poll watchers record video of a voter in the polling place. What the heck do you think is going to happen with that? There's only one foreseeable impact, and that's intimidating people and discouraging them from voting, especially because the only people that could be recorded are those receiving assistance who are disproportionately Latino and AAPI in Texas because of language assistance needs, as well as our disabled community. And one of the other pieces of that bill, and again, I'll try to be brief as well, would limit the number of voting machines that we could have at polling places, but not all polling places, just the ones in our counties with very large populations. Just like Saira said, who tends to do well in those counties and who tends to be voting in those counties? Democrats tend to do well, and those counties are disproportionately Black and Latino. And so those are the voters that would be harmed. And we don't have to look that far to see what the impact is. When you restrained the number of voting machines and had them too similar between the polling places, regardless of what the data showed. And March 3rd, we had an 8-hour line at TSU in Harris County. And there were folks who didn't vote until 2 or 3 a.m. in that county. We don't need to look that far. We saw what happens. And that is the problem that this bill is going to create. The other bill that we're looking at is House Bill 6, which criminalizes a lot of parts of our election code. So you hear, in the criminal justice conversation over the past several years, we are trying to decriminalize things and bring police out of place, out of certain parts of our community because of the opportunities for escalation. And what we heard testimony on HB 6 is that the solution, because the poll watcher the poll worker can't remove the poll watcher. The solution is to bring police into the polling place. That is not a solution. And that solution would also clearly harm our Black and Brown communities most because of histories of tensions with the police within those communities. So House Bill 6 does a litany of things, mainly around that criminalization and around poll watchers as well. But again, like you said, Representative Martinez Fischer, they are solutions in search of problems because none of this is backed by evidence of what happened in 2020 that would lead to these alleged solutions.
Well, look, it's crazy. I mean, it almost seems like with the exception of drop boxes, we could just take the Georgia proposal, scratch out Georgia, put Texas, file it here. I mean, and it's what it sounds like. My quick reaction is I did read a comment from Tarrant County Judge Whitley. Judge Whitley's a Republican, and he said something to the effect of, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we lost power and froze our rears off, essentially. And all you're worried about is the number of polling locations I have in my county. Like, give me a break. I mean, we have real things to work on. And so it almost seems to me like, again, I mean, this is really, a solution in search of a problem. I heard a lot of that in the testimony from the committee hearing, but it just seems to me that those in charge are like hell bent on just jamming this through one way or the other. Am I reading that right?
Absolutely. But I would go a step further. The problems that we have in our election system and our voting system in Texas are not that, people are voting who shouldn't be voting, not that, there's too many opportunities to vote. But if you look at the national studies, Texas is the hardest state in the country to vote in already. All of these bills would only make it harder. Our citizens persevered through a pandemic where our governor refused to make common sense accommodations that almost every other state made to allow people to vote in 2020 and had record turnout. And that is in spite of all of those limitations. But folks should not have to go through all that. Folks should not have to make a choice between their health and their right to vote, and all of these, or making a couple hours wages and their right to vote in terms of limiting hours at the ballot box and things like that. We shouldn't have to make these choices. Voting should be convenient. And there are so many opportunities that our legislature has to do that they're just choosing not to exercise. First among them being offering online voter registration, like 40 other states, many of them governed by Republicans, do, because it just makes sense.
Right. Well, and I'm reminded too, that here in Texas, elections are administered at the local level, even counties the authority to manage elections. Is that the case, Saira, in Georgia as well?
It is. And funny you should mention that, because Georgia has 159 counties. So we're, helping there's local administration, 159 different places. We say elections that are administered 159 different ways. The only state in the United States that has more counties than Georgia is Texas.
254. And so, and one of during this pandemic, I'm from Bexar County, which is San Antonio, Saira, and our county commissioners court, our county judge made the decision to send vote by mail applications to any person over the age of 65, which under current law you can do. I mean, they're eligible to vote. From these provisions, Rose, in Senate Bill 7, House Bill 6, is it my understanding that my county it'd be illegal for my county to do that should that become law?
Absolutely. Yes, both of these bills would prohibit county election officials from sending out those applications to folks who are eligible, which is absurd from a lot of standpoints, including voter access, but also just good administration of elections, right? We saw the post office saying, get these applications in as early as possible, make sure you get them in so then there's time for your ballot to get to you, and all the other pieces of the process. So from an election administration standpoint, if I'm the one running the election, I want to get those apps out so that as many people as possible apply as early as possible. So we're not all rushing at the last minute and stressing about it and, creating room for error, or for the post office to not be able to deliver things on time. So there's of course, the voter suppression angle here, where they're just trying to prevent the elderly and folks with disabilities from being able to vote. But there's also just the bad policy angle, where it's just like making things worse from a purely logistical standpoint with no rhyme or reason.
Right. And I saw another provision in the Senate bill that, under current Texas law, if you have a disability, you elect that you're disabled, you get your application, you get your ballot at home. Now the provision, I believe, requires you to prove your disability. And for many people that have to get a doctor's note or go make a recent appointment to get that disability, they will pay for that. And so there is an argument to say, is this a new poll tax being placed on disabled voters that have to go spend money to prove their disability? What's your take on that, Rose?
Absolutely, it would have been a poll tax. And, the disabled community and advocates from around the state were disgusted by that doctor's note provision in SB 7 and testified extensively about it. And then Senator Zaffirini put forward an amendment to take that provision out of the bill that was successful. So that is no longer in Senate Bill 7. But it just shows the extreme lengths that our elected representatives are going to prevent people from voting, right? Like a doctor's note for folks who have a disability, that is a poll tax that adds time. It's just unreal to put those sorts of barriers between folks in their ballot box.
This is crazy. It's crazy. I mean, I could talk about this for days, and I want to cover two other areas. I mean, Saira, I want some guidance from you. You obviously you have the legislative hangover already from Georgia. Your session's over, and you probably had a lot of sleepless nights, and especially as this election debate ended. Give some folks in Texas some advice in terms of how we engage and how we mobilize, and what can people do in this state if you don't agree with these proposals and you believe these are Jim Crow tactics, voter suppression tactics. Give us some advice. What can we be doing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So keep the pressure on, keep this in the public discourse. I mean, some of the things that were proposed were, so unconscionable. And by bringing them up, we were able to get the worst parts of the bill out. So there was one provision, for instance, that prohibited weekend voting. And we were able to get that out eventually because so many people spoke against that. And I know it can seem like, when these bills have so much in them and there's so many bad things, I think it's really important to prioritize what the worst things are and bring in coalitions that can focus on those bad things so that your message is more effective and resonates further. I think that's really important. And then also, everyone has to put in their all, but also take care of themselves, because this stuff is so draining. It's so exhausting because they are not just attacking voting rights. They are attacking us as a party. They are attacking us as individuals, and just to take good care of us, yourself and each other, because this is very difficult work. I know there's a huge coalition in Texas, though, that is there alongside with Rose that is working on these issues. And I'm really excited to see what you all will be able to do to prevent some of the worst measures from going forward.
Well, Rose is obviously very, very kind and too humble to impose, but I'm exactly the opposite. I will tell you, during those special elections for the U.S. Senate, I saw a lot of Texas resources export to Georgia. I saw folks that would do voter engagement here in Texas, making phone calls to Georgia voters. I even had my friends from Texas go to Georgia and actually boots on the ground and campaign. And so we may have to call on some of our friends in the Peach State to come help us out in Texas and deal with this. And so, I'm sorry for inviting you all or inviting myself to that party, but we need your help.
We're all a team. And I can tell you, in the day after the November election, I got a text message from Rose saying, "What can I do to help?" And I took her up on that. So we are, happy to have you as partners, and we're there for you all the way.
Well, perfect. Well, let's end the segment with this. I want both your perspectives. I mean, with all the shenanigans taking place in Georgia, you're being punished for your success. You're being punished for finally proving what everyone said you couldn't do. You helped put President Biden and Vice President Harris in the White House. You elected two Democrats to the United States Senate for the first time in a very long time, and one of those senators now sits at the desk of one of the great Georgia senators who happened to be a segregationist and user of the filibuster. And so just the revenge takes a while, but you proved it in Georgia that we can put some great members into the United States Senate. And here in Texas, our experience has been too that we are constantly playing defense on voter suppression, whether it's voter ID, whether it's gerrymandered districts, whether it's making voting harder, as Rose mentioned. I want your perspectives. Is it about time that we look at a national voting rights standard with HR 1 that has now passed the U.S. Congress and currently sits in the United States Senate? Is the Georgia and Texas experience enough proof to demonstrate that we just need to have a Voting Rights Act across the board at the federal level? Rose, I'll start with you.
Absolutely. Texas is showing that exactly the need for the Voting Rights Act and for new measures to ensure that we have standardized elections across the country. Our Texas legislators positing these bills want to say that we need standard elections across Texas. Well, I need the same voting rights here in Texas that folks have in Georgia and in California in terms of being able to register to vote online. When I go to renew my driver's license, that my information is automatically updated, and that they can't close polling places predominantly in Black and brown communities in our state. And so our legislators are sadly showing that, obviously our Republican legislators are clearly showing that they can't be trusted to look out for Texans. So we're going to need our federal legislators to pass those voting rights acts and make sure that that doesn't happen again, and that we don't actually have Jim Crow 2.0 implemented. Stop it before they can get it moving.
Perfect. And, Saira, and just, tell us, I mean, what are our newest members of the U.S. Senate? What are they doing in an effort to bring a voting rights standard for the entire country?
It's so refreshing to have representation in the US Senate that believes in voting rights, and not just believes in voting rights, but makes it a priority of their platforms. Senators Warnock and Ossoff are fighting for this. I mean, they see the importance of this. Both of them have very deep connections with former Representative John Lewis, who, of course, this was his life's work. So we just have a deep history of fighting for these things here in Georgia. And, ever since the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, it is evidence that we need these things, federal regulations in place to keep us on the straight and narrow. I'm very excited to see what the possibilities are with HR 1 and where that's going to get us as a country.
Well, I remember when Shelby County decision was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, and for those that aren't familiar, that was the decision that said that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act could no longer work because there's a formula that was drawn up in Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act that was outdated. And so the commentary was that Section 5 is still a good tool, but the input, the formula that we use to decide which local government or which state should be with extra scrutiny when it comes to voting rights, that formula was outdated and specifically said, this is the job of the United States Congress. And so this is now before the United States Congress. The U.S. House of Representatives has already made up its mind and sent a bill over to the U.S. Senate. And I think the irony here is that now, as this bill will have its day before the U.S. Senate, whether in committee or on the floor, there is the threat of a filibuster to keep it from going forward. Our historians and folks familiar with the filibuster have now taken us to realize that the filibuster was actually used to deny civil rights, to fight against segregationists in the South. And so if there was ever a fitting moment to sort of cast the filibuster to the side and put it where it belongs on the sideline, it is to restore voting rights for our country and to have a fair playing field for everybody, no matter your zip code shouldn't matter, what the rules are to vote, the color of your skin shouldn't matter, how you're going to vote, who you love shouldn't matter when it comes to your voting rights. We have one standard, let's all follow it. And so listen, I really, really appreciate it. I didn't know we can pull this off. I didn't know anybody in Georgia. And so, Rose, thank you so much for connecting us with Saira. Saira, keep us engaged. If you see us moving down the pipeline and I think we can benefit from having this communication with folks who've just been through it in the state of Georgia and obviously, did not give up and have made this a national talking point. So we will continue to fight our fight, but we certainly would love to have a partner in that fight. So, Rose and Saira, thank you for being on this pod. And I really, really appreciated chatting with you today. Well, that about does it. We had a wonderful show. I want to thank my guests, Saira and Rose. Thank you for your fight on behalf of the Democratic parties in Georgia and Texas. Folks, let's listen to what they said. This fight is not over. We need to be seen. We need to be heard. We need to fight for our right to vote. No one's going to take it away from us. This is Politics. We will see you next week.